The Armstrong Whitworth A.W.52 was an attempt by Britain in the late 1940s to dabble with the possibility of using a flying wing aircraft for commercial rather than military use. This was not the first time flying wings had been considered as a viable aircraft design. In Germany, Hugo Junkers had patented his own concept for a wing-only transport way back in 1910, and then later the Horten brothers began working on their own flying wing concepts as well. The Soviets began testing tailless flying wing gliders in the 1920s, and the Americans were looking into the possibility of flying wing bombers in the 1930s, an obsession that would finally culminate 6 decades later with the introduction of the Northrop B-2 Spirit stealth bomber. The outbreak of the Second World War put paid to a lot of design ideas for commercial aircraft, but it did speed up the advancement of aviation research and development. Critically, it sped up the development of the jet engine. By 1943, it was reasonably assumed that the future of most major and long-range commercial air travel would be with aircraft powered by jet engines. Armstrong Whitworth put forward a proposal for a flying wing airliner powered by either 4 or 6 jet engines. The design called for a very large aircraft in order to provide headroom for the expected passengers that would be seated within the wing itself. As with most new and experimental designs, it was of course important to test the design on a smaller scale first to prove the concept actually worked safely. A wooden glider designated AW-52G was built. The glider was designed to be roughly half the size of the jet-powered AW-52 prototype, which itself would only be about half the size of the envisioned jet airliner. To give a sense of scale, the proposed airliner was expected to have a maximum takeoff weight of around 20,000 pounds or 90,000 kilograms, which is the equivalent lifting power that you would find in a modern Boeing 737 or an Airbus A320. Now, imagine being able to offer this sort of capacity in the 1950s, and you can see why, on paper at least, this design provoked interest. After extensive wind tunnel testing, full design work and construction on the wooden glider began in 1943. The glider had a wingspan of 53 feet 10 inches, and in the closing months of the Second World War, the glider performed its maiden flight on March 2, 1945, being towed aloft by a Whitley bomber. The glider was far more primitive than the jet-powered prototypes that would follow, its main goal being to establish general flying and load speed handling characteristics. Typically, the glider would be released at an altitude of around 20,000 feet, which allowed for flight times of approximately 30 minutes. While basic, the glider did include one innovative, albeit complicated feature, which was an automated pitch management system. It was basically a system of correctors placed between the main wing structure and the elevons. This system was necessary to overcome a large problem faced by those who design flying wings, which is that the use of flaps on said flying wings had a nasty habit of causing lethal trim changes to the aircraft, their longitudinal forces being so tightly managed. The correction system was automatic, with manual adjustment made available for high-power flapped situations, like an aborted landing that would require a go-around. The glider trials proved to be very successful, and Armstrong Whitworth received a contract to produce 2 AW-52 jet-powered prototypes for evaluation. The AW-52 was intended for high speeds and was an all-metal turbojet-powered aircraft. It had a 90-foot wingspan and an approximate takeoff weight of 20,000 pounds. Though they were designed for research and development purposes only, the prototypes had generous cargo space behind the cockpit, which granted them a maximum takeoff weight of around 34,000 pounds. This serviceable cargo capacity eventually led to evaluations for the AW-52 themselves to be used as mail carriers. Aerodynamically, these jet prototypes had a lot in common with the glider that preceded them. Both aircraft featured a swept wing of 35 degrees, with a center section having a straight line trailing edge. The wingtips carried small end-plate fins and rudders. Now this technically means they aren't true flying wings because of this, but I'd still be inclined to classify them under the category of flying wings, as that is the dominating design feature of the aircraft. Roll and pitch were controlled with elevons that extended inward from the wingtips over most of the outer swept part of the trailing edge. The elevons moved together as elevators and differently as ailerons. They were quite complicated surfaces which include trim tabs and hinged not from the wings but from the correctors, which were wing mounted, and the correctors provided the pitch trim. To delay tip stall, air was sucked out of a slot just in front of the elevons. Now, that was done by pumps powered by undercarriage-mounted fans on the glider and directly from the engine in the AW52 jet. The inner center section wing carried Fowler flaps, and the upper surface of the outer section carried spoilers. Maintenance of laminar flow over the wings was critical to the design, and so the aircraft was built with extreme attention to surface flatness. Rather than build up wings from spars and ribs, Armstrong Whitworth elected to craft expensive and extremely precise formers, as used in high-performance sailplane wings, and fabricate the upper and lower surfaces separately. A stressed skin of alloy sheet was fixed to each former, and a corrugated inner skin attached as stringers, and ribs were then attached to the corrugators themselves. The precision of their design for the time was astonishing. The AW52's wing skins were produced with a contour accuracy within 0.002 of an inch. Now, the construction was that precise that they forewent the painting of RAF roundels on the wings, which are normally found on test aircraft, because the thickness of the paint on the wing surface would actually be detrimental. Both jet engines on the aircraft were centrifugal flow jets. Now, axial flow jets would have fitted completely into the airfoil, however, British advancements in axial flow jets weren't quite up to par with the requirements when the AW52 was being designed and built. The first prototype, designated TS-363, was pretty much completed by the end of 1946. But ongoing problems with the hydraulic system meant that the first flight would not take place for almost another year, its wheels finally lifting off the runway on November 13th, 1947. The first prototype and the second had different engines. The first was powered by two Rolls-Royce Nena engines, which each produced 5,000 pounds of thrust. The second prototype would be powered by Rolls-Royce Derwent engines of a lower power output of 3,500 pounds each. The AW52 was shown off to the public on December 16th, 1947. Members of the government, press, and the aviation industry gathered at RAF Bitteswell to watch Whitworth's chief test pilot, Squadron Leader Eric Franklin, take the aircraft up for a demonstration flight. The reception from both government and press was very favourable, and Franklin himself felt confident enough with the aircraft's handling that after just 5 hours of flight time, he flew the aircraft out in close formation with an Avro Lincoln bomber for Flight magazine to get some exciting photos for their January 1948 article. However, despite the aircraft's impressive looks and warm reception, there were indeed problems. In what appeared to be a fairly typical development, the flutter speed of the flying wing was discovered to be worryingly lower than predicted. It was such an issue that the aircraft had to be limited to a top speed of just 300 miles an hour, which was considerably lower than the predicted speed of 500 miles an hour. Further trials of the aircraft proved disappointing. Laminar flow could not be maintained, and the top speed barely increased because of the dangerous wing flutter, which itself was probably a result of poor laminar flow. These issues culminated rather catastrophically on the 30th of May 1949. Whilst putting the aircraft in a dive at 320 miles an hour, test pilot Joe Lancaster encountered a pitch oscillation caused by the dreaded wing flutter. This oscillation started at an uncomfortable 2 cycles per second and rapidly increased in frequency to incapacitating levels. Expecting imminent and fatal structural failure, Joe Lancaster ejected using the aircraft's Martin Baker ejection seat. In doing so, Joe Lancaster became the first British pilot to eject in an actual emergency, rather than being in the relative safety of a test environment, proving the effectiveness of the ejection seat that would go on to save the lives of countless service personnel the world over. It was fortunate that Joe was alone in the aircraft, as the second crew member that would normally occupy it was not actually provided with an ejection seat. As luck would have it, the aircraft, left to its own devices, stopped fluttering and glided down to land itself in an open country field with relative little damage. Following this incident, and in view of the disappointing results obtained, no further development of the flying wing formula was undertaken by Armstrong Whitworth, who had now turned their attention to the more conventional AW55 propeller turbine airliner. The second AW52 was handed over to the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough, where it was used for experimental flying until finally disposed of for scrap in 1954.